Not every prison has bars. Some use words, silences, and doors that never close. When love blinds, cruelty finds a way, until the truth decides to show up. Some homes hide pain beneath luxury, but the truth always finds a crack to get in. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you are watching us from. We continue. The mansion stood imposingly in the Kensington district of London, surrounded by high walls that seemed to conceal more than protect. The wrought iron gates opened onto an immaculate garden where every shrub was perfectly placed and every flower followed an almost artificial order. It was the kind of house that appeared in decorating magazines, with its designer furniture and original artworks hanging on the walls. But within those marble and crystal walls, something essential had been lost. Human warmth, the kind that transforms a building into a home, had been replaced by a chill that penetrated to the bone. Eleanor walked slowly through the wide corridors, her steps almost silent on the gleaming floor. At 68, she maintained an erect posture and a serene gaze, the result of decades cultivating the discreet elegance that had always been her hallmark. Her grey hair, pulled back in a simple bun, framed a face with soft features, where wrinkles told stories of laughter and tears. She wore a discreet navy blue dress, no jewelry, save for the gold wedding band she had never removed from her finger, even after her husband passed away 5 years ago. In that simple dress and that solitary ring resided all her dignity. The house was slowly waking up on that Tuesday morning. Eleanor heard sounds coming from the kitchen, where the staff were already preparing breakfast. The smell of fresh bread wafted up the marble stairs, mingling with the aroma of brewed coffee. It was a smell that should bring comfort, memories of happy family mornings. But for Eleanor, that aroma only heralded another day of heavy silences and averted glances. She paused before the corridor window, observing the garden below. The cherry trees she had planted herself when Richard was a child were laden with fruit. She remembered how the boy would run barefoot across the grass, climbing the trees to pick the highest cherries, returning home with his hands and mouth stained purple. How he laughed in those days, how she laughed along. Richard had grown up to become a respected businessman, heir to the empire his father had built brick by brick. Technology companies, real estate investments, stakes in various sectors. The Mendonça family name was synonymous with success in London, but along with success came constant travel, endless meetings, commitments that took him further and further away from home. And then came Vanessa. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memory flow. She had met Vanessa 4 years ago at a charity gala at the club. The young woman was stunning, of that there was no doubt. Tall, with meticulously styled blonde hair, green eyes that sparkled under the chandeliers. She dressed with refined taste that drew attention without being excessive, and she knew exactly how to win people over. Her smile was broad and welcoming. Her conversation flowed naturally about art, culture, international travel. She came from a family in Washington, D.C. She said she worked as an image consultant for large corporations. Richard fell in love quickly. Eleanor still remembered the sparkle in her son's eyes when he spoke about Vanessa, like a teenager experiencing first love. He brought her for Sunday dinners, introduced her to friends with visible pride. Vanessa, in turn, was attentive to Eleanor. She praised her home, asked for decorating advice, listened with apparent interest to the stories Mrs. Eleanor told about the family's past. Eleanor had even felt hope. After so long alone following her husband's passing, perhaps she would finally have a daughter, someone who would bring new life to that house, too big for just 2 people. The wedding took place in a luxurious ceremony, with 300 guests and discreet but present coverage in the society columns. Eleanor cried during the ceremony, moved to see her son happy. Vanessa was radiant in her French lace gown, and as she hugged her mother-in-law after the ceremony, she whispered words that seemed sincere into her ear. Mrs. Eleanor wanted to believe those words. She needed to believe. The first few months were about adaptation. Vanessa moved into the mansion, bringing with her her belongings, her preferences, her vision of how things should work. Eleanor tried to give her space, to step back a little, to allow the new lady of the house to find her place. After all, it was natural for a wife to want to make changes, to put her personal mark on the environment. Richard spent more and more time traveling, expanding the business to other states and countries. He trusted his wife to take care of everything in his absence, and Vanessa embraced this role with impressive efficiency. The changes began subtly, small things Eleanor barely noticed at first. One day, her favorite armchair, the one where she used to sit to read in the afternoon, was repositioned to a less illuminated corner of the living room. Vanessa explained that it would improve the harmony of the room. Eleanor agreed without questioning. Then some of the old photographs that decorated the sideboards were replaced with modern design pieces. Vanessa argued that the house needed an aesthetic renovation. Again, Eleanor nodded. They were just objects after all. But then the changes began to penetrate deeper layers. Vanessa suggested that Eleanor might prefer to have breakfast in her room, as she woke up earlier than them, and thus wouldn't have to wait. Eleanor said she didn't mind waiting, that she enjoyed the company. Vanessa insisted with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, that it would be more comfortable that way. Eleanor yielded, wanting to avoid conflict. Family meals, once sacred, became rare. When Richard was home, Vanessa organized dinners with friends and clients, events where Eleanor felt out of place amidst business conversations she didn't fully understand, and people who barely noticed her. Vanessa always introduced her politely, but there was something in the way she said, "Richard's mother," with an almost imperceptible emphasis that made Eleanor feel not like a part of the family, but like a distant relative visiting. One evening, Eleanor came down for dinner and found the table set for only 2 people. Vanessa and Richard were already seated, beginning their meal. Mrs. Eleanor stood in the entrance to the dining room confused. Vanessa looked at her with a rehearsed expression of surprise and said she thought Eleanor had already eaten, that she always ate earlier. Eleanor murmured that, no, she hadn't eaten, but already felt the weight of embarrassment on her shoulders. Richard, distracted by his phone, barely looked up. Vanessa gestured for a staff member to prepare a plate for her mother-in-law, but the moment was ruined. Eleanor sat at the table, but the food seemed tasteless in her mouth. The situations accumulated like small stones, one on top of the other, building an invisible wall. Eleanor began to notice that her clothes were moved in the closet, that her toiletries disappeared and were replaced by others without anyone asking her. Once, searching for her favorite shawl, the one her husband had given her on a trip to France, she discovered it had been donated to charity. Vanessa explained that she was decluttering old things and thought Eleanor no longer used that old shawl. Eleanor felt tears burn her eyes, but said nothing. How to explain the sentimental value of an object to someone who saw only its worn appearance? Richard seemed oblivious to everything, or perhaps he just didn't want to see. He returned from trips exhausted, his mind full of numbers and strategies. He hugged his mother quickly, asked how she was in a tone that didn't expect a sincere answer, and soon became engrossed in conversations with Vanessa about house renovations, about the next trip, about the social engagements she had scheduled. Eleanor watched her son from afar, seeing him grow increasingly distant, as if a thick fog had settled between them. She tried a few times to strike up a conversation with him. She asked about the business, about his plans, about how he felt about so much travel. But Richard answered briefly, politely, but disinterestedly. Vanessa was always nearby, always with a timely interruption, always redirecting her husband's attention to another subject. And Eleanor retreated, not wanting to be seen as the meddling mother-in-law, the one who couldn't accept her son's wife. Her greatest fear was exactly that Richard would think she was trying to cause problems in his marriage, that he would see her as those possessive mothers who appear in soap operas, the ones who can't accept that. Their children have grown up and have their own lives. Eleanor remembered her own mother-in-law, a bitter woman who spent years trying to sabotage her marriage, spreading intrigues and creating misunderstandings. She had sworn to herself she would never be like that, never become that kind of mother. So Eleanor chose silence. She swallowed her hurts, kept the words she wanted to say, and continued smiling when Richard asked if everything was all right. "Yes, everything is fine," she replied. And he believed because he wanted to believe, because it was easier to believe. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. Eleanor's routine became a predictable sequence of lonely days. She woke early, had her breakfast alone in her room, as Vanessa had suggested. Then she went down to the garden, where she spent hours tending to the plants. It was there, among the flowers and trees, that she found some peace. The plants didn't judge, didn't lie, didn't make her feel invisible. They simply grew under her care, responding to affection with green leaves and colorful blossoms. In the afternoon, Eleanor used to read in the library, that room that had been her husband's and which she kept exactly as he had left it. The mahogany shelves held hundreds of books, many with annotations in the margins made by his hand. She ran her fingers over those words written so long ago, seeking some solace in the ghostly presence of the man she had loved. Vanessa rarely entered the library. She said the room was too dark, too old-fashioned. She had suggested several times transforming it into something else, perhaps a yoga room or a modern office. But Richard, in one of the rare times he contradicted his wife, had said the library would remain as it was. It was one of the few memories of his father he wanted to preserve intact. Eleanor silently thanked him for that small victory, for that one space in the house that was still hers. Meals became increasingly solitary. Eleanor no longer came down for dinner unless specifically called. She ate in her room or in the kitchen, after everyone else had finished. The staff, Mary and Claudia, looked at her with thinly disguised pity, but said nothing. They too were afraid of Vanessa, who managed the house with an iron fist disguised in a velvet glove. It was Mary who first noticed the change in Eleanor's eating habits. Mrs. Eleanor was losing weight, her dresses becoming increasingly loose. Vanessa had started personally supervising what was served to her mother-in-law, claiming concern for her health. She said Eleanor needed a special diet, suitable for her age, to avoid cholesterol and blood pressure problems. Portions were reduced. Dishes became simpler, almost Spartan. Eleanor accepted without complaint, believing that perhaps Vanessa truly was concerned about her well-being. But there were times when hunger gnawed at night, and Eleanor would sneak down to the kitchen, hoping to find some leftovers. More than once, she found the refrigerator locked with a padlock. Vanessa explained that it was to prevent staff from taking food home without permission. Eleanor would return to her room empty-handed, her stomach rumbling, feeling a humiliation she couldn't name. Richard was traveling more and more, weeks on end away, returning only to resolve urgent matters before leaving again. When he was home, Vanessa monopolized his time. There was always a party, an event, a social engagement that required their presence. Eleanor watched her son hurry through the corridors, always rushed, always with his phone glued to his ear. He greeted her from a distance, promised they would talk later, but later never came. One morning, Eleanor woke with a sharp pain in her chest. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, an anguish that suffocated her. She got up and went to the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked like a stranger. Her eyes had lost their sparkle, her cheekbones were more prominent, her skin had an unhealthy pallor. When had this happened? When had she become this shadow of herself? She thought about talking to Richard. She mentally rehearsed the words she would say. "Son, I need to talk to you. I'm feeling very lonely in this house. I miss our time together." But whenever she tried to start the conversation, Vanessa would appear, interrupt, divert the subject, and Richard, so absorbed in his business and his wife, didn't perceive the urgency in his mother's eyes. Eleanor began to write letters, long letters, where she poured out everything she couldn't say aloud. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling out of place in her own home, of the fear of becoming a burden. She folded each letter carefully, placed it in an envelope and left it on Richard's office desk when she was sure he would be alone to read them. But the letters were never mentioned. Richard didn't talk about them, showed no sign of having read them. Eleanor didn't know that Vanessa intercepted them before her husband could see them. She didn't know her words were torn up and thrown in the trash without anyone reading them. She merely concluded, in her innocence, that her son had read them and chosen not to respond, perhaps not knowing what to say, perhaps thinking she was being dramatic. The isolation increased. Vanessa suggested that Eleanor might prefer to stay in one of the back rooms of the house, less exposed to the afternoon sun, quieter. She said it would be more comfortable, that she could have more privacy. Eleanor resisted a little, but Vanessa insisted with a poisonous sweetness, saying it was for her own good, that the main room was too busy with staff coming and going. Richard, when consulted, merely agreed distractedly with his wife, without even visiting the back room to see if it was suitable for his mother. The move happened one morning when Richard was traveling. Staff carried Eleanor's belongings to the small room at the back of the house, a room previously used for storage. Vanessa supervised everything, ensuring that only the essentials were taken. Many of Eleanor's things were put into boxes and stored in the basement, where humidity and time would slowly erase them. The new room was dark, with a single window overlooking the back wall. There was no view of the garden that Eleanor loved so much, no sunlight she used to receive in the mornings. The bed was smaller, the wardrobe simpler. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and looked around, feeling something break inside her. It was as if she was being pushed out of her own life, relegated to the margins of existence. That night, alone in the back room, Eleanor cried for the first time in a long time. She cried in silence, her face buried in the pillow, so no one would hear. She cried for the life she had lost, for the son who seemed to have forgotten her, for the home that was no longer hers. But even crying, she couldn't muster the strength to confront the situation. The fear of being seen as a problematic mother-in-law, of pushing Richard further away, of destroying his marriage, was greater than her own pain. And so Eleanor continued, waking up every day in that dark room, smiling when she met someone in the corridors, pretending everything was fine. She had become a master of disguise, of hiding sadness behind a mask of serenity. The staff knew but could do nothing. Vanessa had eyes and ears in every corner of the house. Anyone who tried to help Eleanor or tell Richard the truth would be fired immediately. Time passed, and Eleanor faded away. Not physically, though her body grew increasingly fragile, but in essence. She was there walking through the corridors, sitting at the table when called, but she wasn't truly present. She was like a ghost inhabiting her own life, watching from afar as everything continued without her. Richard called from his travels, always rushing, always with little time. He asked about his mother quickly, and Vanessa answered for her, saying that Eleanor was fine, resting, busy with her reading. He believed because it was convenient to believe, because his life was so full of other concerns that there was no room to question. Eleanor looked out the back room window, seeing only the high wall surrounding the property. That wall that once protected, now imprisoned. She thought of her husband, how he would react if he knew what was happening to her. He had always been a strong, protective man who would never allow anyone to hurt her. But he was gone and she was alone, navigating murky waters without knowing how to ask for help. Sometimes, in the silent early hours, Eleanor wondered if it wouldn't be better to leave. Not in the final sense, but simply to move out of that house, find a small place to live alone, far from that theatre of appearances. But then she thought of Richard, how he would interpret her departure. He would think she was rejecting the life he offered, that she was being ungrateful, and Eleanor couldn't bear the idea of hurting her son, even if he unknowingly was allowing her to be hurt every day. So she stayed. She stayed and endured. She stayed and waited. She waited for a miracle she didn't know if it would come. She hoped that Richard, somehow, would open his eyes and see what was happening right under his nose. She hoped that the love between mother and son, that love that nothing should be able to destroy, would be strong enough to pierce the fog of lies and appearances that Vanessa had built around them. But meanwhile, the days continued the same, one after another, in a painful monotony that was corroding Eleanor's soul. And she kept smiling, kept pretending, kept surviving. Because that's what she knew how to do. Survive. Even when surviving was the hardest thing in the world. The months that followed Eleanor's move to the back room marked an even steeper descent into the abyss. The mansion, with all its opulence and grandeur, had transformed into a sophisticated prison where Eleanor was a prisoner without a crime, serving a sentence she didn't fully understand. Vanessa had established a rigid routine that on the surface seemed aimed at everyone's well-being, but in practice served only to further distance Eleanor from family life. The daughter-in-law had convinced Richard that his mother needed special nutritional monitoring, appropriate for her age, and the supposed medical recommendations that Eleanor would later discover never existed. Eleanor's meals began to be prepared separately, with increasingly smaller portions and simpler ingredients. Mary, the cook who had worked in the house for over 15 years, felt her heart ache every time she had to prepare those meager meals. She remembered when Eleanor used to come into the kitchen on Sunday mornings, helping to prepare family lunch, sharing old recipes and stories from her youth. Now Mrs. Eleanor rarely appeared in the kitchen, and when she did, it was like a shadow quickly crossing the room, afraid of disturbing anyone. One Thursday afternoon, while Richard was in Washington, D.C. dealing with government matters, Vanessa entered the kitchen with a bag in her hands and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mary was preparing dinner, and Claudia, the maid, was organizing dishes in the cabinet. Both stopped what they were doing when their boss entered, knowing that her presence there rarely meant anything good. Vanessa placed the bag on the marble counter and pulled out a large package of dog food. It was a premium brand, the kind that costs a lot and promises complete nutrition. Mary looked at the package, then at Vanessa, not understanding. The family didn't have a dog. Never had. Vanessa's explanation came with that sweet voice she knew how to use so well, but which carried a subtle venom. She said she had read about a new trend in alternative eating, something that was having success in European countries. Diets based on functional foods, processed to maintain all essential nutrients. And that specific food, she explained, was made with organic ingredients, prime-quality meat, selected vegetables, much more nutritious and balanced than many foods people consumed. Mary looked at Claudia, who quickly lowered her eyes, returning to arrange the dishes with trembling hands. The cook tried to argue, saying she could prepare balanced and nutritious meals using fresh ingredients, that she had always done so, with great care. But Vanessa cut her off with a wave of her hand, reminding her who was in charge of that house. She said she wasn't asking for an opinion, she was giving an order. Eleanor would receive that special diet for a week, as a test to see if her health improved. That night Mary cried as she prepared the first meal. She ground the dog food until it became a kind of flour, mixed it with a little vegetable broth to give it a less grotesque appearance, and molded it into small portions that looked like dark meatballs. Her hands trembled as she arranged it on a fine porcelain plate, trying to make it look minimally edible, but nothing completely disguised what it really was. Eleanor was in the back room, sitting in the old armchair she had managed to rescue from the basement, trying to read a book by the dim light of the bedside lamp. Hunger was already a constant companion. Her clothes hung loosely on her thin body, her collarbones protruded under her pale skin. When Mary knocked on the door bringing the dinner tray, Eleanor felt a momentary relief. At least she would eat something. But when she uncovered the dish, confusion overwhelmed her. It didn't look like anything she knew. Mary stood beside her, her eyes red, unable to look directly at Mrs. Eleanor. Eleanor picked up the fork and tasted one of the small portions. The taste was strange, not exactly bad, but definitely not ordinary food. It had a dense texture, a strong flavor she couldn't identify. Mary couldn't take it anymore. Tears began to roll down her face as she murmured an almost inaudible apology. Eleanor dropped the fork and looked at the staff member, realizing something was profoundly wrong. She asked what it was, her voice soft but laden with growing anxiety. Mary tried to repeat the story Vanessa had told about the alternative diet, the special nutrients, but the words came out broken between sobs. It was then that Eleanor saw the dog food packaging that Mary inadvertently had left visible on the tray hidden under a napkin. Reality crashed down on her like a ton of bricks. She was eating dog food. Her daughter-in-law, the woman her son loved, was feeding her animal food. Eleanor felt her stomach churn, stood up too quickly and had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. Her legs weakened, her vision darkened for a moment. Mary held her arm, helping her to sit down again. The cook begged forgiveness, said she had been forced, that Vanessa had threatened to fire her if she didn't obey, and she needed the job to support her 3 children alone. Eleanor, even amidst the devastating humiliation, managed to hold Mary's hand and say that she understood, that it wasn't her fault. But inside, something was irreparably breaking. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay on the narrow bed, staring at the cracked, sealing, trying to process what had happened. How had she reached this point? How had life led her here? She, who had always been treated with respect, who had built a family, who had dedicated decades to caring for her husband and raising her son, was now being fed like an animal. The humiliation was so profound that she couldn't even turn it into tears. It was something beyond crying, a wound in her soul that couldn't be expressed. She thought about telling Richard. She imagined the scene, her son arriving from his trip, her calling him to talk privately, revealing what was happening. But then came the fear. What if he didn't believe her? What if he thought she was exaggerating, creating drama, trying to cause problems in his marriage? Vanessa was so convincing. She knew how to manipulate situations so skillfully. She would twist everything, make it seem like Eleanor was lying, inventing stories out of jealousy or resentment. Richard loved his wife, trusted her blindly. He would choose to believe Vanessa. And there was another, even deeper fear. The fear that even if he believed her, Richard would feel obligated to choose between his wife and his mother. Eleanor couldn't bear the idea of putting her son in that position. She didn't want to be the cause of his marriage's destruction. She remembered how he looked at Vanessa, that sparkle of happiness in his eyes. If she took that away from him, she would never forgive herself. So Eleanor made the decision that so many women in abusive situations make, that decision that seems incomprehensible to outsiders. She decided to remain silent. She decided to endure. She decided that her suffering was a price worth paying to preserve her son's happiness. It was a convoluted logic, born of unconditional love mixed with fear and shame, but it was the only logic she could construct in that moment of despair. The following days were an ordeal. Vanessa maintained the charade of the special diet for a full week, as she had promised. Eleanor forced herself to eat because hunger was worse than humiliation. She chewed those small portions without looking directly at them, imagining she was eating something else, anything else. Her body reacted poorly. Her stomach ached. She felt constant nausea. But she didn't complain, didn't ask to stop. Mary, whenever she could, hid some fruit or a piece of bread in Eleanor's room, small gestures of silent rebellion against Vanessa's cruelty. Claudia also helped when she could, leaving secretly prepared fritters or a cup of oatmeal. These were small gestures, but to Eleanor they meant she wasn't completely alone, that someone still cared. Richard called during that week, one of his quick calls from the airport. Vanessa answered, put him on speakerphone while organizing papers on the office desk. He asked how everything was, how his mother was. Vanessa replied with that sweet voice saying Eleanor was fine, that they were even trying a new, very healthy diet for her, recommended by a renowned nutritionist. Richard seemed satisfied, said it was good to know his wife was taking such good care of his mother. Eleanor was in the corridor, listening to that conversation, and felt something die inside her. Her son believed every word. He had no idea what was really happening. When the week of the special diet finally ended, Vanessa announced that the results had not been as expected and they would return to normal eating. But that normal was no longer what it had been before. The portions remained small, meals continued to be served separately, and Eleanor remained confined to the back room, increasingly invisible in her own home. Social isolation also increased. Vanessa began hosting friends for afternoon teas and sophisticated lunches, events that filled the mansion with laughter and lively conversations. Eleanor could hear everything from the back room, those cheerful voices echoing through the corridors, reminding her that life continued normally for everyone, except for her. On one such occasion, she mustered courage and left her room, thinking of joining the group, of trying to resume some kind of social interaction. When she entered the room where the women were gathered, silence was immediate. All looked at her with a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. Vanessa quickly stood up, coming to Eleanor with a forced smile. She said, loud enough for all to hear, that her mother-in-law must be confused, that this wasn't the day for their weekly meeting, that it was next week. Eleanor tried to explain that she didn't know about any weekly meeting, but Vanessa was already gently guiding her out of the room, saying she should go back to rest, that perhaps she was a little disoriented. Vanessa's friends observed the scene with looks of pity and a certain discomfort. Some of them had their own mothers-in-law and could, in a flash of empathy, imagine what it would be like to be in that position. But none said anything. It was easier to believe Vanessa's version, the idea that the mother-in-law was a slightly confused elderly lady, than to confront the possibility that something cruel was happening there. Eleanor returned to her room with her cheeks burning with shame. Public humiliation was different from private. She knew those women would talk about her, that they would comment among themselves about poor Richard's confused mother-in-law. The narrative Vanessa had built was perfect. She didn't need to be openly cruel, didn't need to shout or offend. It was enough to create situations where Eleanor seemed out of place, confused, outdated. And so, slowly, Eleanor's reputation was being eroded, transforming her into a figure of pity in the eyes of others. The household staff watched everything with a mixture of helplessness and guilt. Besides Mary and Claudia, there was John, the gardener who had cared for the gardens for years, and Sebastian, the driver who had always been discreet and loyal to the family. They all knew what was happening, but they all had their reasons for not acting. Jobs were hard to come by. Vanessa paid well and didn't tolerate insubordination. One false step and they would be fired without references, their professional lives ruined. But John, who was about Eleanor's age and saw her as a second mother, could no longer bear it. One day, when Richard was in the city but stuck in endless meetings, John tried to talk to him. He waited in the garage, knowing his boss would pass by there at the end of the day. When Richard finally appeared, exhausted and with his tie loosened, John gathered all his courage and approached. He asked permission to speak about a delicate matter. Richard stopped, looked at his watch impatiently, but nodded for him to continue. John began to speak about Mrs. Eleanor, about how she was different, thinner, sadder. He said that perhaps Mr. Richard should spend more time with her, talk, check if everything was all right. His words were careful. He didn't dare to directly accuse Vanessa, but he tried to plant a seed of doubt. Richard listened, but his mind was elsewhere. He thanked John for his concern, said he knew his mother was getting older, and that was natural, and that Vanessa took very good care of her. He patted John's shoulder, got in the car, and drove away. The gardener stood there, feeling he had failed, that his words had not been enough to break through the barrier of trust that existed between Richard and Vanessa. That night, Vanessa called John to the office. Someone, probably Sebastian, who was in the car with Richard, had told her about the conversation. Vanessa didn't yell, didn't get agitated. She just looked at John with those cold green eyes and said she understood his concern, but that he had overstepped his bounds. She reminded him that he was an employee, not a family member, and that he should focus on tending the garden and nothing else. John left knowing he was on the verge of being fired. The message was clear not just for him but for all other employees who might think of doing something similar. Eleanor continued her solitary routine, but something inside her was changing. The humiliation of the dog food had been a turning point, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. A rage was growing, small and timid still, but present. An inner voice that began to whisper that this wasn't right, that she didn't deserve to be treated this way, that she needed to do something. She started writing letters to Richard again, but this time with more direct words. She spoke of feeling out of place, of the solitary meals, of the back room. She didn't mention the dog food, still lacking the courage for that, but she tried to make her son understand that something was wrong. She put the letters in envelopes and left them directly in his room under his pillow, where she was sure he would find them, but Richard never found them. Vanessa searched the room every morning, looking for anything that might pose a threat to the control she exerted. She found the letters and methodically destroyed them, sometimes reading them first to understand what Eleanor was thinking, adjusting her strategies accordingly. It was a cruel game of chess, where Eleanor moved her pieces without knowing that Vanessa already knew all her moves. One dawn, Eleanor woke up thirsty and went down to the kitchen. The house was silent, plunged into darkness. She tried to open the refrigerator and found the padlock Vanessa kept there. She tried the cupboards, but most were also locked. Finally, she found a tap and drank water directly from it, feeling like an intruder in her own home. That's when she heard footsteps. Vanessa appeared at the kitchen door wearing a silk robe, her hair loose over her shoulders. For a moment, the two women looked at each other in silence. Eleanor saw something in her daughter-in-law's eyes that chilled her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. It was worse. It was total indifference, as if Eleanor was an insignificant thing, an insect that could be crushed without the slightest remorse. Vanessa said nothing. She just kept staring with that half-smile on her lips until Eleanor lowered her eyes and left the kitchen, returning to her room. But that silent encounter in the dark marked something important. Eleanor finally understood that she wasn't dealing with a difficult daughter-in-law or a personality clash. She was dealing with something much darker, with a deliberate cruelty that had no rational justification. Days passed and Eleanor withered, not just physically, although her body was increasingly fragile, but emotionally. The light in her eyes was dimming day by day. She, who had always been a woman with an easy smile, who found joy in small things, now walked through the corridors like a ghost, expressionless, without hope. Mary commented to Claudia one afternoon when they were alone in the laundry room that Mrs. Eleanor was becoming increasingly quiet, more absent. She said that sometimes she would find her in the garden, standing before the cherry trees, just looking at the trees without moving, as if she were in another world. Claudia agreed, adding that she had found Mrs. Eleanor crying alone in the library more than once, holding old photographs from when her husband was still alive. The two staff members felt helpless. They wanted to help but didn't know how. Vanessa was always attentive, always controlling, always 2 steps ahead of any attempt to support Eleanor. It was like trying to save someone who was drowning while you yourself were trapped in a cage, only able to watch. Richard continued his travels, increasingly absorbed in business. The company was expanding into international markets. Complex negotiations were underway. A lot of money was at stake. He called home when he could, but conversations were always brief and superficial. Vanessa filtered everything, creating an alternative reality where everything was perfect at home, where his mother was well cared for and happy. And so they reached the point where the story was about to take a definitive turn. Eleanor was at the limit of what she could bear. Vanessa was too confident, committing her acts of cruelty with less and less caution, believing she had total control of the situation. Richard was completely oblivious, living in the carefully constructed lie. And the staff watched everything, carrying the weight of forced complicity, waiting for a miracle they didn't know, if it would come. The storm was brewing on the horizon, still invisible but inevitable, and when it finally arrived, it would sweep away all the lies and appearances, leaving only the naked, raw truth to be faced. Friday morning began like any other in the Kensington mansion. The sun was still low on the horizon when Mary arrived to start her shift in the kitchen. Vanessa was already awake, drinking her almond milk latte and flipping through a decorating magazine on the veranda. Everything seemed to follow the usual rhythm of that house, where appearances were everything. Richard had been in Manchester for a week, in a series of meetings with potential investors for a new sustainable technology venture. He had called the previous night, saying he probably wouldn't return until Sunday after finalizing some contract details. Vanessa had bid him farewell over the phone with that sweet voice she reserved for moments when others could hear, saying she would be waiting, that she would take care of everything at home as always. But what Vanessa didn't know was that the negotiations in Manchester had concluded more quickly than expected. The investors, impressed with the proposal, signed the agreement on Thursday evening. Richard, exhausted but satisfied, decided to anticipate his return. He wanted to surprise his wife, perhaps take her to dinner at a special restaurant, celebrate that important business victory. He took the first flight on Friday morning, without telling anyone. Eleanor woke early that day, as always. The back room was still plunged in gloom, the single window barely letting in the dawn light. She felt the familiar pain in her spine, the result of months sleeping on that old uncomfortable mattress. She got up slowly, put on the worn bathrobe she insisted on using despite Vanessa, having suggested many times that it be discarded. She looked at herself in the small mirror hanging on the wall and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back had sunken eyes, pale skin stretched over the prominent bones of her face. Her hair, which she used to keep neat, was now dull and thin. She had aged years in a matter of months. She quickly averted her gaze, unable to look for long at that image which represented her silent defeat. Vanessa had travelled the previous night to a spa in the Hamptons, or at least that's what she had told the staff. In truth, she had only been gone a few hours and returned in the early morning, but she maintained the story to have a justification if needed. She was in an excellent mood that morning, mentally planning the following week, when Richard would be travelling again and she would have total control of the house. Around 9 in the morning, Vanessa called Mary to the living room. The cook arrived, wiping her hands on her apron, apprehensive as she always was when her boss summoned her. Vanessa was sitting on the grey velvet sofa, her legs elegantly crossed, a cup of green tea in her hand. She looked at Mary with that smile that wasn't really a smile and gave her instructions for the day. She said that Eleanor had woken up in a difficult mood, defiant and rude, completely unlike her usual self. It was a lie, of course, but Vanessa was building another one of her narratives. She instructed Mary to prepare only a very light meal for her mother-in-law throughout the day, claiming that she needed to learn to control her fits of irritation. Mary felt her stomach churn, but merely nodded, knowing that any protest would be futile and dangerous for her job. What Vanessa decided that day, however, surpassed all previous limits. Perhaps it was the feeling of absolute power, the certainty that Richard was far away and wouldn't return anytime soon, or simply cruelty finding a new level. She instructed Mary to once again serve that special dog food to Eleanor for lunch, but this time in an even more humiliating way. It should not be disguised or mixed. It should be served raw, directly on a plastic plate as one would give to an animal. Mary felt tears burn her eyes. She begged Vanessa to reconsider, said it was inhumane, that Mrs. Eleanor didn't deserve to be treated that way. But Vanessa merely hardened her expression and reminded Mary that she had 3 children to raise alone, and that jobs like that were not easy to find. The threat was clear. Mary left the room with shaky legs, knowing she would have to obey, hating herself for it. Meanwhile, Richard was in a taxi coming from the airport, watching the city pass by the window. London was congested as always, the slow traffic making the journey take longer than he would have liked. He thought of Vanessa, how good it would be to see her, to hug her. He also thought of his mother, feeling a pang of guilt for having been so absent. He promised himself that weekend he would spend quality time with Eleanor. They would talk like old times when he was a child and she was his whole world. It was almost 11 o'clock when Richard finally arrived at the mansion. He paid the taxi and entered through the main gate, carrying only a small carry-on bag. The house was silent, bathed in the strong, midday light. He walked through the garden, distractedly noticing how well tended the plants were, John's work for sure. He opened the front door with his key and entered the marble hall. The silence of the house was disturbing. Richard called for Vanessa but got no response. He went upstairs to the master bedroom, but she wasn't there. He came back down, looking in the living room, in the office. That's when he heard a sound coming from the direction of the kitchen. It wasn't normal conversation, it was muffled voices, as if someone was arguing in low tones. Richard walked towards the kitchen, his steps silent on the floor. The closer he got, the more he could distinguish the voices. One was Mary's, sounding distressed. The other was Vanessa's, cold and authoritative. And there was a third, weaker sound that made his heart clench without him understanding why. It was a suppressed, choked, desperate cry. He pushed open the kitchen door, and the scene that unfolded before him was like a punch to the gut. Eleanor was kneeling on the floor, her trembling hands holding a cheap plastic plate. Inside the plate was something Richard didn't immediately identify, but which clearly wasn't human food. His mother's face was wet with tears, her eyes red and swollen, her posture stooped like someone who had been broken inside. Mary stood beside her, her face also bathed in tears, her hands covering her mouth in a gesture of horror and helplessness. And Vanessa was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, observing the scene with a thinly disguised expression of satisfaction. When the door opened and Richard appeared, time seemed to freeze. Vanessa was the first to react, her face instantly changing to an expression of surprise and forced joy. She started to say something about how good it was to see him home early, but Richard wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on his mother, on that woman kneeling on the floor like a punished child, holding that plate with something he now recognized as dog food. The rage that surged within him was unlike anything he had ever felt. It was a primitive, visceral fury that made his hands tremble and his heart pound. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, knelt beside his mother, and took the plate from her hands. Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of shame and relief, unable to speak, just crying silently. Richard slowly rose, holding the plate, and turned to Vanessa. His voice, when it finally came out, was laden with such intense emotion that the words seemed to tear his throat. He asked what that was, what was happening there. Vanessa tried to maintain her composure, began to explain that Eleanor had been disobedient, that she needed to learn limits, that this was just a necessary correction. But Richard didn't let her finish. He shouted for the first time in years, a scream that echoed through the entire house and made Mary jump in fright. He said that this was not correction, it was cruelty, it was abuse, it was something sick and unacceptable. Vanessa tried to argue, said he didn't understand, that she took care of his mother all the time, and that he had no idea how difficult it was, how many times Eleanor had been ungrateful and complicated. It was then that Eleanor, still on the floor, finally found her voice. It was weak, broken, but it was there. She said none of it was true, that she had never done anything to deserve that treatment, that she had been humiliated for months. The words poured out in an avalanche, everything she had held in for so long finally leaking out. She spoke of the meager meals, of the back room, of the first time she received that disguised dog food, of the isolation, of the letters she had written and that he had never answered. Richard listened to everything with a breaking heart. Every word was like a stab, revealing a horror that had happened right under his nose, while he was too busy, too trusting, too blind to see. He looked at Vanessa and didn't recognize the woman he had married, or perhaps she had always been that person, and he simply had never wanted to see. Vanessa realized she was losing control of the situation. She tried to change tactics, moving from explanations to tears. She began to cry, saying she did everything out of love for him, that his mother was trying to separate them, that it was a conspiracy. But Richard didn't believe a single tear. There was something in her eyes, even as she cried, that was cold and calculating. He helped his mother up from the floor, held her by the arms, with a delicacy that contrasted with the rage he felt. Eleanor was trembling all over, barely able to stand. Richard then realized how thin she was, almost skeletal, her bones visible under her skin. How had he not noticed before? How had he let it get to that point? He turned back to Vanessa and said, with a voice now chillingly calm, that she had 1 hour to pack her bags and leave that house. Vanessa tried to protest, said that was her house too, that he couldn't just kick her out like that. Richard replied that she had lost any right to that house the moment she began to abuse his mother. He said he would speak to his lawyers, that he would initiate divorce proceedings immediately, and that if she did not leave voluntarily, he would call the police. What Richard didn't know was that John, the gardener, was outside the kitchen having heard the beginning of the argument. And in a decision that would change everything, he took out his phone and started recording. He didn't record Richard arriving, but he captured the moment Vanessa was still trying to justify her actions, using increasingly cruel words about Eleanor. He recorded when she called her mother-in-law a useless old woman, dead weight, someone who should be grateful to still have a roof over her head. He also recorded the part where Eleanor, still crying, confirmed the abuses. Vanessa finally left the kitchen, went up to the bedroom in a mix of fury and despair. She started throwing clothes into suitcases, breaking things along the way, cursing words she had never let slip before. The mask of elegance and composure had completely fallen. Richard stayed with his mother, seating her in a chair, asking Mary for water, trying to comfort her while dealing with his own overwhelming guilt. It was Mary who, after giving Eleanor the glass of water, pulled Richard aside and told him everything. She told him about the first time Vanessa had forced her to serve that dog food, about the letters Eleanor wrote that mysteriously disappeared, about the progressive isolation, about all the small and large cruelties she had witnessed but couldn't report out of fear. Richard listened with tears in his eyes, hugged Mary, and thanked her for taking care of his mother as best she could under the circumstances. Claudia also appeared, bringing Sebastian, the driver, and John. Everyone wanted to make sure Mrs. Eleanor was well. They wanted to somehow apologize for not being able to do more. Richard told them all that there was no fault, that they had been in an impossible position, and that now things would change. Vanessa came down an hour later, dragging 2 large suitcases across the marble floor. Her face was red with rage, her eyes hard as stones. She passed Richard without a word, but as she passed Eleanor, she couldn't resist unleashing one last venom. She said that the old woman had gotten what she wanted, that she finally had her son all to herself, but that it wouldn't last, that he would soon see he had made a mistake and would regret it. Richard opened the door, took her suitcases, and literally threw them outside. He told Vanessa never to come back, never to attempt contact again, that from now on any communication would be through lawyers. She slammed the door, shouting threats about suing him for everything, about destroying his reputation, about making him pay dearly for that humiliation. But the story would not end there. John, still holding his phone with the recorded video, hesitated. He didn't know what to do with it. He showed it first to Mary and Claudia, who were shocked to see and hear Vanessa that way. Mary suggested showing it to Richard, but John had another idea. He knew a journalist who worked for a well-known news website, someone who had always treated staff well when doing a story about the mansion years ago. That same night, without telling anyone, John sent the video to the journalist, along with a brief account of what had happened. He explained that he was doing it because he believed people needed to know who Vanessa Mendonça really was. Behind the facade of a refined and charitable woman, she showed on social media and at charity events. The journalist, recognizing the story's potential, verified the basic information and published the video on Saturday morning. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The video went viral in a matter of hours, being shared thousands of times across all social media platforms. People were horrified by what they saw and heard. The comments were a mixture of indignation, outrage, and solidarity with Eleanor. Vanessa, who was staying in a luxury hotel on Oxford Street, woke up to her phone exploding with notifications. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers were sending messages, tagging her in posts, commenting on the video. Her first reaction was panic, then fury. How had this leaked? Who had recorded it? She immediately called her lawyer, demanding they do something to take the video down, to sue whoever was responsible. But the internet doesn't forget and doesn't easily forgive. Even when some sites took the video down under legal pressure, it had already been downloaded and reposted hundreds of times. Gossip pages, news profiles, digital influencers, everyone was talking about the case. Vanessa's name became one of the most commented topics in the country that weekend. Richard was dealing with his own crisis when he heard about the video. He felt a mixture of anger at having his private life exposed in that way, but also a strange relief. Now it wouldn't just be his word against Vanessa's. The whole world had seen the truth. His mother was with him in the library, wrapped in a blanket, eating a warm soup that Mary had prepared with great care. Eleanor seemed smaller than she was, frail, but there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It was as if finally the weight she had been carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. Vanessa, desperate to control the damage, did something that only worsened her situation. She called a press conference, gathering journalists in a hotel ballroom. She appeared impeccably dressed, perfect makeup, erect posture. She began by reading a prepared statement where she portrayed herself as a victim of an ungrateful and manipulative family. She said she had always cared for her mother-in-law as if she were her own mother, that she had sacrificed her career and social life to dedicate herself to that family, and that she was now being unfairly defamed by an edited video taken out of context. She alleged that Eleanor had always been a difficult person, suffering from age-related mental confusion, inventing stories to get attention. She said the dog food on the plate had been a misunderstanding, that it was part of a veterinary diet recommended by a specialist she refused to name. Her explanations sounded increasingly absurd, contradictory, desperate. Journalists asked difficult questions that she couldn't answer satisfactorily. The interview was a disaster. Instead of improving her image, it only confirmed what people already thought of her. Social media exploded again. this time with memes, parodies, body language analyses, pointing out her lies. Vanessa became a symbol of everything wrong in family relationships, an example of cruelty disguised as care. Companies that had partnerships with her began to cancel contracts. The club where she was a member suspended her membership. Friends who had previously flattered her now avoided being seen with her, or publicly declared that they had always suspected something was wrong. The fall was swift and brutal. Meanwhile, in the Kensington mansion, Richard spent every available minute with his mother. They talked for long hours, she recounting everything she had been through, he listening with a broken heart. He apologized countless times, cried, holding her, promised he would never let anything like that happen again. Eleanor, with that generosity that always characterized her, said there was nothing to forgive, that he hadn't known, that Vanessa was very good at hiding her actions. But Richard knew he should have noticed. The signs were all there. He had just chosen not to see them. Guilt was something he would have to learn to live with, transforming it into determination to be better from then on. That night, mother and son dined together, just the two of them, on the veranda overlooking the garden. Mary prepared Eleanor's favorite dish, and for the first time in a long time, Mrs. Eleanor ate with appetite, savoring every mouthful, finally feeling at home again. The days that followed Vanessa's expulsion were a mixture of relief and pain for Eleanor. It was as if she was waking from a long, suffocating nightmare, but the awakening brought with it the full awareness of everything she had lost during that dark period. Richard cancelled all his engagements and trips, something his team received with surprise but understanding when he explained briefly that he needed to attend to urgent family matters. The first change Richard made was to move his mother back to the main bedroom she had occupied for so many years. He himself helped carry her belongings from the back room, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness at seeing the conditions in which she had been living. The mattress was sunken, the wardrobe smelled of mold, the window barely opened. How had he allowed his mother to be relegated to that miserable space? Eleanor resisted, a little at first, saying she didn't want to cause trouble, that she was used to the back room. But Richard insisted with gentle firmness, saying that this house was hers as much as his, that she should never have left that space in the first place. When Eleanor finally entered her old room, she sat on the bed that had been hers for decades and let the tears fall freely. They were tears of relief, of accumulated pain, of something that was beginning to heal. Mary and Claudia worked tirelessly to make the room perfect again. They changed the bedding, placed fresh flowers in the vases, brought back the photographs Vanessa had ordered stored away. John entered the garden earlier than usual to pick fresh cherries and leave them in a small basket beside Eleanor's bed, remembering how much she loved those fruits. These were small gestures, but each one was a way of saying that she was loved, that she was important, that she should never have been treated that way. Richard spent that first week essentially by his mother's side. They talked for hours, making up for lost time. Eleanor recounted everything, every detail of the humiliation she had suffered, and although it was painful to relive those moments, there was also a necessary catharsis in transforming silence into words. Richard listened with total attention, holding her hand, apologizing repeatedly, even when she insisted he was not directly to blame. It was during one of these conversations that Eleanor casually mentioned the letters. She said she had written to him countless times, trying to explain how she felt, leaving the envelopes in the office, in his room, in places where she was sure he would find them. Richard was confused, said he had never received any letters. Eleanor looked surprised for a moment, then a dark understanding passed over her face. Vanessa. Of course it was Vanessa. Richard immediately got up, determined to look for evidence. He started with what had been their bedroom, searching drawers, wardrobes, every corner where Vanessa might have hidden something. It was in the back of her closet, inside an expensive shoebox that no longer contained shoes, that he found them. There were stacks of envelopes, all addressed to him in Eleanor's delicate handwriting. Some were open, others still sealed, as if Vanessa hadn't even bothered to read them. Richard returned to his mother's room with the letters in his hands, his face pale. Eleanor looked at that pile of correspondence and felt something break and reconstruct at the same time within her chest. So, he really had never received them. He hadn't deliberately ignored her. Vanessa had intercepted everything, creating an abyss of silence between mother and son. They spent the entire afternoon reading the letters together. Some were recent, from a few months ago, when Eleanor was already at the height of despair. Others were older, from the beginning of the marriage, when the problems were still small, but already beginning to grow. In each letter, Eleanor expressed her love for her son, her desire not to cause problems, her fear of being seen as a meddling mother-in-law. And in each of them, there was also a silent plea for attention, for presence, for love. Richard cried as he read those words. He cried for his mother, who had suffered in silence, for the distance Vanessa had created between them so efficiently, for his own blindness in not realizing what was happening. Eleanor put her arm around her adult son's shoulders, comforting him as she had done so many times when he was a child, saying that the important thing was that now they were together again. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Vanessa was in freefall. The video continued to circulate, being analyzed, commented on, shared. Television programs discussed the case, psychologists gave their opinions on her profile, lawyers debated the possible legal consequences. Vanessa had become a nationally known name, but for all the wrong reasons. She tried to sue Richard for defamation and emotional distress, claiming he had unfairly exposed her, and that the video had been manipulated to make her look worse than she was. She hired one of London's most expensive lawyers, a man known for winning impossible cases. The lawsuit was filed with great fanfare, Vanessa giving interviews saying that the truth would prevail, that she would prove her innocence. But the truth, when coldly examined by the eyes of justice, was not on her side. Richard's lawyers presented testimonies from all the household staff, each confirming the abuses they had witnessed. Mary spoke about the dog food, about the meager portions, about the cruel orders she had received. Claudia confirmed Eleanor's progressive isolation, how she had been pushed to the back of the house, literally and figuratively. John brought the original unedited video, showing that there was no manipulation, that those horrible words had indeed come from Vanessa's mouth. A doctor was called to examine Eleanor and confirm the malnutrition, the physical and psychological consequences of prolonged abuse. The report was devastating for Vanessa's defense. It showed a woman who had been systematically deprived of adequate food, who had suffered severe psychological trauma, who showed clear signs of having been a victim of emotional and physical abuse. The judge who presided over the case was known for his sensitivity in family matters. He himself had an elderly mother whom he cared for with great affection, and perhaps for this reason, Eleanor's situation touched him particularly. After analyzing all the evidence, he not only rejected Vanessa's lawsuit against Richard, but also ordered her to pay court costs, and made it clear in his judgment that he considered her actions not only morally reprehensible, but potentially criminal. The judgment was published and widely disseminated. Public opinion, which was already against Vanessa, solidified completely. She lost the last vestiges of reputation she still held. Brands that had residual contracts with her immediately cancelled. Them, the club that had only suspended her membership, now permanently expelled her. Friends who still maintained some contact out of politeness now completely avoided her. A deeper journalistic investigation revealed that this was not Vanessa's first case of abusive behavior. A former employee who had worked for her years before, when she still lived in Washington, D.C., contacted the press and told similar stories. She spoke about how Vanessa treated people she considered inferior, about the casual cruelty with which she referred to employees, about episodes of humiliation she had witnessed. Another person who had been involved with Vanessa in the past also came forward, speaking about emotional manipulation and controlling behavior. The portrait that emerged was of a woman with a well-established pattern of abusive behavior, someone who knew exactly how to present a charming facade while exercising cruelty in the shadows. Richard read these reports with a mixture of horror and understanding. How had he not seen the signs? But then, Vanessa was a master at hiding her true nature, at showing only what was convenient. While the media circus continued outside, inside the Kensington mansion, a slow and careful healing was taking place. Richard hired a specialized nutritionist to help Eleanor regain weight in a healthy way. He also brought in a therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Beatrice, who began weekly sessions with Eleanor to help her process the trauma she had lived through. The sessions were difficult at first. Eleanor had trouble talking about certain aspects of the abuse, felt ashamed to admit how broken she had been, was afraid of appearing weak. But Dr. Beatrice was patient and understanding, explaining that there was no shame in being a victim of abuse, that Eleanor's strength was in having survived, in still being there, fighting, to recover. Gradually, Eleanor began to improve. Her weight returned little by little, color returned to her face, the sparkle reappeared in her eyes. She returned to tending the garden, spending hours among the plants, finding peace in that connection with the earth and nature. Richard often joined her in the mornings, learning about the flowers she cultivated, listening to stories about each plant, about how his father loved that garden. It was during one of these afternoons in the garden that Eleanor casually mentioned that there were some boxes of her husband's belongings in the basement that she had never had the courage to fully open. Richard felt a nostalgic curiosity and suggested they go together to look at those boxes. Perhaps it was time to revisit those memories, to reconnect with the man who had meant so much to both of them. They went down to the basement one Saturday afternoon when the house was quiet. The boxes were dusty, stored in a corner for years. Richard and Eleanor opened them carefully, finding old clothes, documents, photographs yellowed with time. There were also books, some with annotations in the margins made by the family patriarch's firm handwriting. It was like opening a time capsule, touching pieces of a life that had existed fully and now lived only in memory. It was in the last box, at the bottom, among old papers and receipts kept for some forgotten reason, that Eleanor found the envelope. It was different from the others, newer, and had Richard's name written on the front. The handwriting was her husband's, no doubt, but the paper wasn't yellowed like the other documents. Eleanor picked up the envelope with trembling hands and looked at Richard. He came to her side, equally intrigued. They opened the envelope together, and inside was a letter. It was dated a few days before his father's passing, when he already knew his time was running out, but still had the strength to write. The letter began with words of love and pride, speaking about how Richard had become an admirable man, how he would continue to make his father proud even after his passing. But then the letter took a different, almost prophetic tone. The father spoke about choices, about character, about the importance of valuing the right people, and there was a specific paragraph that made both Richard and Eleanor hold their breath. The father wrote that when Richard found someone to share his life with, he should observe how that person treated those who could offer nothing in return. He said that a person's true character is not in how they treat the powerful, but in how they treat the vulnerable. And then came the words that seemed written specifically for that moment, even though they had been written years before. If one day you marry someone who does not respect your mother, you will be trading love for appearance. And that, my son, has a price that the soul slowly collects. Take good care of your mother. She gave you life, dedicated her best years to you. Do not let anyone diminish her or make her feel less important. When I am no longer here, she will need you. Be for her what I can no longer be. Richard read those words once, twice, 3 times, each reading hitting him with renewed force. It was as if his father was there, in that dusty basement, reminding him of something essential he had forgotten. Eleanor was also crying, touching the words written by her husband's hand, feeling his presence in a way she hadn't experienced in years. They came up from the basement with the letter, sat on the veranda overlooking the garden, and stayed there in silence for a long time. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with oranges and pinks, the cherry trees swaying gently with the afternoon breeze. Richard finally broke the silence, saying his father was right, that he had traded something precious for a brilliant but empty illusion. Eleanor held her son's hand and said something that Richard would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said that he hadn't traded love for appearance, that he had just taken a little longer to see the truth. She said that the important thing wasn't the mistake made, but the courage to correct it, and that she had never stopped loving him, not even in the darkest moments, because that was the kind of love a mother has, a love that doesn't give up, that doesn't tire, that patiently waits for reunion. It was in that moment, on that veranda, with the sun setting and his father's letter between them, that Richard fully understood the depth of what he had almost lost. It wasn't just about the humiliations his mother had suffered, although those were terrible. It was about having drifted away from the person who had always been by his side, who had raised him with love and dedication, who had sacrificed so much for him. It was about having chosen to believe empty promises instead of trusting the unconditional love that had always existed. In the following weeks, Richard made important decisions about the future. He decided he needed to step away, at least temporarily, from the corporate world that had consumed so much of his life and attention. He promoted trusted executives to handle day-to-day operations, maintaining only strategic oversight. He wanted time, real quality time, to rebuild his relationship with his mother, to care for her as he should have always done. He and Eleanor began planning a temporary move. They no longer wanted to stay in that enormous mansion, with its corridors full of recent bad memories. Richard bought a smaller house in a mountain town, a quiet place surrounded by nature, far from the bustle of London, and away from the curious eyes of the media still interested in the case. The move happened on a sunny autumn day. Mary, Claudia, John and Sebastian helped with the move, and there were farewell tears. Richard assured everyone that they would keep their jobs, that trusted employees would care for the mansion in his absence, and that they were always welcome to visit them in the new house. Mary hugged Eleanor for long minutes, saying she finally felt at peace knowing Mrs. Eleanor was safe and loved. The house in the mountains was exactly what they needed, smaller, cozier. With a spacious garden that soon became Eleanor's favorite project, she planted new flowers, tended the trees, created a small orchard. Richard joined her in the mornings, learning about gardening, getting his hands dirty with soil, discovering a peace he never knew existed. They established new routines. Breakfast always together, at the kitchen table, unhurried, talking about plans for the day. Afternoon walks on nearby trails, Eleanor gradually regaining physical strength, Richard discovering the beauty of simply being present. Dinners on the veranda, telling stories, laughing at old memories, creating new ones. Eleanor began to write, no longer desperate letters that no one would read, but a diary of reflections, thoughts, memories. She wrote about her husband, about Richard's childhood, about the lessons life had taught her. She also wrote about the dark months, not with anger, but with an understanding that it had been part of her journey, that from that suffering emerged a strength she didn't know she possessed. Richard also changed profoundly. The man who once lived rushing, always with his phone in hand, always thinking about the next deal, now knew how to stop and observe. He watched his mother tending the plants with such care and understood that this was the true value of life. It wasn't in the numbers of a financial statement. It wasn't in the praise of business colleagues. It was there, in those simple moments of genuine connection. A few months after the move, on an exceptionally clear night, they were sitting on the veranda, looking at the stars. Eleanor commented that she felt for the first time in a long time completely at peace. She said the scars were still there, that they probably always would be, but that they no longer hurt as before. They were just marks of a battle she had survived, reminders of her own resilience. Richard picked up his father's letter, which he now always kept close, and reread those words about not trading love for appearance. He looked at his mother and said he finally understood what his father had tried to teach him. He said the most valuable thing he possessed was not the company, not the mansion in London, not the growing investments. It was that moment, there on that simple veranda, beside the woman who had given him life and who had continued to love him even when he didn't deserve it. Eleanor smiled, that gentle smile that had always been her hallmark, now recovered in its fullness. She held her son's hand, feeling the strength in those fingers that had also held hers when he was small, when she taught him to take his first steps. The circle was complete, the roles naturally reversed, and now it was he who supported her, who guided her, who made sure she would never feel alone or invisible again. Vanessa's story reached their ears occasionally, through news that still circulated. They learned that she had left London, that she was living in another city under a different name, trying to rebuild a life away from the negative spotlight. Richard, no. longer felt anger, only a distant sadness for someone who was so broken inside that she could only function by breaking others. Eleanor said she had forgiven Vanessa, not because what she did was forgivable, but because carrying anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. She chose to release that weight, to focus on gratitude for the present she had recovered, for the second chance life had given them. And so, in that small house in the mountains, far from the noise and pressure of the big city, mother and son learned to live again. They learned that family wasn't about grand gestures or material possessions. It was about presence, about listening, about being there in good times and bad. They learned that true love was patient, waited, forgave, rebuilt. On a particularly beautiful afternoon, when the flowers Eleanor had planted were all in bloom, and the garden looked like an impressionist painting, she was watering the plants, while Richard read on the wooden bench he had built himself. He looked up from his book and watched his mother, noticing how light she seemed, how graceful her movements were again, how peace inhabited every gesture of hers. He called her to sit beside him. Eleanor came, drying her hands on her apron, and sat down with that satisfied sigh of someone who had worked well and was now resting. Richard put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, and for the first time in a long time said the words he should have said every day. He said he loved her, that he was grateful for her, that he wouldn't know who he would be without everything she had taught him and continued to teach him. Eleanor rested her head on her son's shoulder and murmured that he had always been her greatest pride, that even in difficult times she had never stopped believing in him, knowing that he would find his way back to her. She said that this was the ending she had always known would come, because their love was stronger than any temporary darkness. Not every prison has bars. Some use words, silences, and doors that never close. When love blinds, cruelty finds a way, until the truth decides to appear. Some homes hide pain beneath luxury, but the truth always finds a crack to enter. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us from which city you are watching us. We continue. They sat there as the sun set once again, painting the sky with impossible colors. The breeze carried the scent of flowers, the distant sound of birds preparing for the night. It was a perfect moment in its simplicity, a moment worth more than all the businesses, all the possessions, all the appearances that Richard had once deemed important. For the first time in years, the house had become a home again, not for its grandeur or luxury, but because it was inhabited by true love, by mutual understanding, by forgiveness and rebuilding. It was a home because it was lived in by people who chose to be together, who valued each other's presence above all else. And as the night gently descended upon that blossoming garden, mother and son remained there side by side, at peace with themselves and with each other, knowing they had weathered the storm and found their way back home. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Eleanor and Richard has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of pain, resilience, and reunion, please leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what moment touched you the most. Was it Eleanor's silent strength, Richard's transformation, the power of forgiveness? We want to know what this story awakened in you. Every day we bring intense stories like this, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, which make us reflect on our own relationships and choices. Don't miss the next episode, where a new story will move you and make you think. We await you here always with stories that touch the soul. See you soon.